The morning fog still clung to the valley like a pale gray blanket when Elijah Mercer swung himself onto his horse and turned toward the lower road. The one few people rode unless they had to. It was the road that led past broken fences, empty homesteads, and the small cabin everyone referred to as the widow's place. Elijah had not planned to ride out that way himself. He could have sent one of his hands. Could have tucked the, small leather pouch of coins into another man's saddlebag and forgotten about it. But something about unfinished business always sat heavy on his conscience. And when he remembered the widow who had worked through the harshest weeks of winter, without complaint, he decided to go himself. It was only wages, after all. A small sum, a simple task. He had no idea it would change the way he saw wealth, poverty, and grace forever. Elijah Mercer was known throughout the valley as a hard but fair rancher, a man who counted every dollar twice and wasted nothing. His ranch stretched wide across the hills, cattle grazing like dark shadows against the frost-touched grass. He had built it from nothing after the war, hammering boards with bleeding hands and sleeping beneath unfinished roofs. People respected him, feared him a little, and envied him more than they admitted. Yet despite all his success, there was a quiet emptiness in him that no amount of land or money had ever filled. He worked long hours, spoke little, and told himself that survival was purpose enough. The widow's name was Sarah Caldwell. Elijah knew that much and little else. Her husband had died 3 years earlier in a logging accident upriver, crushed beneath a falling pine while trying to earn enough to buy seed for spring. Since then, Sarah had taken whatever work she could find, mending clothes, cleaning barns, cooking for ranch hands, never asking for charity, never lingering longer than needed. When Elijah's cook fell ill in midwinter, Sarah had stepped in without hesitation, feeding men twice her size from a kitchen with barely enough firewood to keep warm. Elijah had promised her fair wages, and today he intended to keep that promise. The horse's hooves echoed softly as Elijah descended into the valley. Smoke curled faintly from the widow's chimney, thin and fragile against the cold air. He expected to see a quiet yard, maybe Sarah herself stepping out with tired eyes and grateful words. Instead, before he even reached the gate, he heard laughter. Children's laughter. It stopped him cold. There were no families left near Sarah's cabin, at least none that Elijah knew of. He dismounted slowly, tying his horse to the fence, and followed the sound toward the open door. Inside the cabin, the sight that greeted him stole his breath. Around a long, rough-hewn table sat children, so many of them that Elijah had to count twice. Thin faces, patched clothes, mismatched shoes. Some were barely more than toddlers, others old enough to work a plow. Bowls of steaming stew sat before each of them, and though the portions were small, every child ate with focused gratitude, as if they knew how rare such a meal could be. Sarah moved among them quietly, ladle in hand, her hair pulled back, her face drawn but peaceful. She smiled as she wiped a child's chin, whispered encouragement to another, and set aside her own bowl untouched. Elijah stood frozen in the doorway, the pouch of coins suddenly heavy in his hand. "Sarah," he finally said, his voice rougher than he intended. She turned, surprise flickering across her face before settling into calm. "Mr. Mercer, I didn't hear you ride in. Please forgive the mess." "The mess?" His eyes swept the room again. "Who are these children?" Sarah hesitated, then sighed softly. "They're hungry," she said simply, as though that explained everything. One by one, the children looked up at Elijah, wary but curious. He recognized some of them then. Orphans of men who had died in mine collapses, sickness or accidents, children who had drifted from home to home, often unwanted, often forgotten. "You're feeding them," Elijah said slowly. "Yes," Sarah replied. "Every day I can." "With your wages?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Sarah nodded. "And what little else I earn." Elijah felt something crack inside him. "Sarah, this money is meant for you. You barely have enough for yourself." She met his gaze steadily. "I have enough," she said. "They don't." The children finished their meal quietly, some licking their bowls clean, before setting them aside with care. Sarah ushered them toward the back room, spreading blankets on the floor. When she returned, Elijah finally handed her the pouch. She accepted it with thanks, but there was no excitement in her eyes. Only relief not for herself, but for the children who would eat again tomorrow. Elijah left soon after, riding back up the valley in silence. The weight he carried was no longer coins, but a question he could not escape. What kind of wealth feeds others before itself? That night sleep would not come easily. The laughter, the thin faces, the widow's quiet strength haunted him. For the first time in years, Elijah Mercer realized that success measured only in land and money was a poor thing indeed. Elijah Mercer did not sleep that night, not truly. He lay on his bed, staring at the dark wooden beams overhead while the valley wind whispered through the cracks of his ranch house, carrying with it echoes of children's laughter that did not belong there but refused to leave his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the widow's table, the thin hands gripping spoons, the way Sarah Caldwell had stood aside while the children ate first, her own hunger swallowed by something far stronger than need. By dawn, Elijah rose with a heaviness in his chest he had never known before, the kind that money could not ease and work could not bury. At first light he rode out again, not toward his pastures or the far fence lines, but back down into the valley. This time he brought more than coins. He brought sacks of flour, salt pork, dried beans, and blankets strapped across his horse. He told himself he was only helping temporarily, that this was practical, that hungry children became desperate adults and desperate adults caused trouble. But deep down, Elijah knew that was a lie. He was riding because something inside him had shifted, cracked open by a widow who owned nothing, yet gave everything. When Sarah opened the door and saw him standing there again, surprise gave way to concern. "Mr. Mercer," she said gently, "you've already paid me." "I didn't expect—" "I'm not here about wages," Elijah interrupted. He stepped aside so she could see the supplies. Her hand flew to her mouth. "This is too much," she whispered. "No," he said firmly. "It's not enough. But it's a start." Word spread quickly in the valley. People noticed Elijah Mercer riding places he never rode before, stopping at cabins he had once passed without thought. They saw wagons leaving his ranch loaded with food, tools, seed, even livestock. At first they whispered. Some said he had gone soft. Others said guilt had finally caught up with him. A few accused the widow of manipulating him. Sarah heard those rumors too, and they weighed on her heart like stones. One afternoon, when the children were playing outside and the stew simmered low, Sarah finally spoke. "You don't owe us this," she said quietly as Elijah repaired a broken chair leg. "People are talking. I don't want charity to become a burden on you." Elijah paused, his hands rough and steady. "This isn't charity," he said. "It's responsibility. I've taken more from this valley than I ever admitted. It's time I gave something back." But the true test came when winter returned early, cruel and unforgiving. Snow choked the roads, cattle sickened, and several smaller ranchers lost everything in a matter of weeks. Fear crept back into the valley like an old enemy. Elijah's foreman warned him to tighten supplies to protect his own. That night, Elijah stood alone in his storehouse, lantern light flickering over rows of grain and preserved meat. He thought of the children, of Sarah's calm strength, of the emptiness he used to call success. And then he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He opened the doors. Food went out first, then seed, then shelter. Elijah converted one of his unused barns into a winter refuge, bringing in families who had nowhere else to go. Sarah took charge without being asked, organizing meals, tending the sick, teaching the older children to read by firelight. She never acted as though she owned authority. She simply served and people followed. The valley survived that winter not because of wealth, but because of unity. When spring finally came, it revealed something astonishing. Fields that should have been barren were planted. Children who should have starved were laughing. Men who once competed now worked side by side. At the first valley gathering after the thaw, Elijah stood before the crowd. He was not a man used to speeches. His voice shook at first, but it grew steadier with truth. "I used to believe a man's worth was measured by what he owned," he said. "I was wrong. It's measured by what he's willing to give away." Then he did something no one expected. He turned to Sarah Caldwell and placed the deed of a portion of his land into her hands. Not as charity, but as partnership. A place for an orphan home, a school, a future. Tears streaked Sarah's face, but she stood tall. "This belongs to all of us," she said. "Not just me." Years later, people would tell the story differently. Some said Elijah Mercer was saved by a widow. Others said a valley was saved by kindness. The truth was simpler and deeper. One man rode out to pay wages, and instead found a purpose. And in the quiet evenings, when children's laughter drifted across land once ruled by silence, Elijah Mercer finally felt rich.